Hi everyone, welcome to the first ever Cookie Bites. I'm Stella Marbles, your host, and this is going to be a monthly chat show where I talk to London's finest and freakiest drag creatures, creatives, movers and shakers about everything from their work, their art, to their darkest secrets. Our special guest today is Prishita Elouise. Prishita is the politics editor for Bricks magazine. They are a trustee with Voices for London, and they're a prolific writer whose work you might have seen in Gathered magazine and Days, to name a few. So, Prishita, thank you so much for coming on the show. And first of all, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. Yeah, it's lovely to talk to you and to virtually meet you because can't believe we've never actually met.
I know, it's surprising considering how, I don't know, connected London is, but it's nice to get to connect with people digitally, and hopefully soon we'll actually be able to be in person. And yeah, so the theme for this episode is community. It's a very broad question. What does community mean for you, or kind of what are the foundations of queer community in your life?
To me, queer community is a home to feel safe and appreciated and supported and cherished, and to be able to meet and work with just the most incredible creatives that I've ever come across in my life, the most passionate people, the most self-aware and loving people, and be able to work towards a better future for all.
Yeah, I think you completely summed it up. And I definitely connect with the idea of community being both a space that feels safe and you can be, your most relaxed self, but it's also a space that challenges you. It's people who push you to be better and think better. From that, how did quarantine kind of change your idea or your appreciation of community? Like, how did you foster and hold on to community during this time when we lost those physical communal spaces?
Yeah. If anything, it's just made it even clearer to me how important that community is. I feel like the physical side of things was taken away from me, and it was quite hard. It was a hard adjustment, but I feel like the community is already so strong on things like social media. And luckily, I had Voices for London, which is the direct action group that I organise with. We continued to have weekly meetings, and we put on some online events. So instead of rallies and protests in person, we did something called Queer Solidarity at Home last year. We asked people to make like signs that they would take to a protest about a queer issue that they feel passionate about, and post a picture of themselves holding it. And we had just the most incredible activists and community organisers from the UK, from Morocco, from Poland, from Bangladesh, speaking about queer issues and how their lives are being impacted by the law and other things that relate to the community.
That's incredible. And I really connect with that idea that even though this has limited us in so many ways in terms of being physically together, it's also created these new opportunities. And on Voices for London, because you are essentially, one of the things you talk about a lot on your social media and obviously in your work is this idea of being like a community organizer. And so can you talk a little bit more about how you got into working for Voices for London and what that word community organizer really means for you?
I feel like there are many different ways to be an activist, and all of them are valid. But I think when it comes to actually bringing together members of the community and like working together towards a specific goal, work towards the future that we see, and to imagine a better world and to turn that hope into action, that requires a lot more commitment, not more necessarily, a different kind of commitment and a different kind of energy. To be a community organizer, I think you have to like give up your comfort for the sake of the wider community and put yourself in positions where you're working towards a better life for the whole community, even when it's sometimes at the sake of your comfort or safety. Calling myself a community organizer rather than an activist helped me sit with that and like be aware of it at all times and actually like follow through on it.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And as queer people, we're many things, but we're not always very organized. And so
True.
someone who can help kind of foster other people's ideas but also help bring people together I think is so important and so needed. And you're completely right. It's an area of activism that and a facet of activism that isn't always acknowledged, and it can often be kind of behind the scenes, but that's how the bigger things kind of are made possible. And how do you think we can return to activism being something that everyone in the community can be involved in, to kind of this communal action, as you put it in one of your articles?
I think activism and action is still something that everyone in the community can get involved with. I think that's why, again, I go with the term community organizer, because everyone can be an activist for something they believe in. When we idolize certain people based on celebrity status or follower numbers, and like a lot of those people haven't even, themselves said that they're an activist. I think we have a tendency, just humans generally, to put people on a pedestal and idolize people and call them activists because they talk about things that they care about or that affect them, but a lot of them haven't even signed up to be an activist. When we do that as people, that dilutes the message that people who are organizing are trying to put forward. It dilutes their actions, focuses too much on individual representation and individual success.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with what you said about it's also something that gets put on a lot of creatives and gets put on a lot of people who are just, they're talking about these issues, whether it's, trans rights or queer rights, because they have to, because we live in a world where it is so hard not to talk about it. It's such a pressing issue in our lives. So it kind of is unwanted responsibility on both sides. And I also think it takes away the idea from people that they have to be involved in community work and involved in activism. Whereas in reality, there's so many ways of doing it. Like you said, there's so much, I think, lately that we've been talking about just in the queer community and in the artistic community about what we've lost, and all the things that have been taken away, which are so real. But I wanted to ask, just as a flip side, what do you think as a community have we gained from the last year? What are kind of some insights that, you feel have helped you or kind of have developed going forward?
I think one of the main ones, which I kind of touched on earlier, is this idea of a global community. I think everyone has sort of broadened their horizons a bit because everything is online and everything is a lot more accessible because everything is online. And I think that's helped people get engaged with things that are happening all over the world, which I think is super important for the community. Voices for sort of motto is that queer people anywhere are responsible for queer people everywhere. I think another thing that I think we've hopefully learned is, despite the fact that a lot of the anti-racism conversations and work that were going on last summer because of the media attention on the Black Lives Matter protests, even though a lot of those conversations, at the time and probably since have been a little bit superficial, probably a little bit performative, I do think that it started a lot of conversations and got a lot more people thinking about these things than would have previously. And racism is a massive issue in the queer community because I think a lot of cis white gay men do think that they can't really oppress others if they're oppressed themselves, and that's just not true. There's so much inherent racism, like in terms of like dating preferences, or even more obvious than that. And hopefully that this is sort of this last year and the conversations around race have hopefully drawn more queer people's attention to addressing racism in the community as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I really think that especially this quarantine kind of gave a lot more credibility and really opened up the potential for online activism and online kind of community work. Because before it was often, and still is sometimes, kind of said, oh, that's just lazy couch activism. It doesn't have any credibility. But which can be true in some cases, but I think that is kind of to take away from the real work and kind of knowledge sharing that these spaces allow. And also, accessibility as well, the fact that anyone anywhere can get involved in this conversation. But also, yeah, it allows like kind of more intersectional conversations, more marginalized voices to get a platform. Obviously it's very imperfect and flawed because that is social media, but yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see that develop, and I think there are a lot of benefits from it that we're going to see long after quarantine. What advice would you kind of then have for, you know, younger queer people who have been struggling to find community?
I know that it must be so hard for so many young people at the moment, especially with so many people having to live with family or, you know, parents or people that they might not feel comfortable being queer around, that they might not feel safe around. And it's definitely really hard that these physical spaces have been taken away. But I think the main advice I would give is, you know, as we've said, so much of that has moved online, and hopefully that has made things more accessible for people who live in rural areas, people with disabilities and accessibility needs who otherwise, you know, did not find these spaces comfortable or safe. Hopefully that's actually increased that accessibility for a lot of people. I think beyond that, I would definitely just say, like, you know, take in lots of queer media, read queer books, watch queer films and documentaries, and just sort of like revel in queer joy. I think there's so much pain and sadness in the world right now, and while it's still important for us to be aware of queer issues and tackling them and acting on them, it's also really important for us to be looking out for queer happiness and queer joy and like absorbing all that in. I think it's a really great time for queer people to like explore things like gender and like you know, their like presentation and identity and stuff, and sort of just like reflect on what actually feels good and right for yourself. Yeah, I've definitely found that journey has been great for me in the last year. I like officially came out as non-binary during the course of the last year, because I was just like, what, you know, why do I need to be presenting anyway for anyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I know lots of people who've had similar journeys of just having that space away from society to reflect and make those changes that sometimes felt a bit awkward when you're constantly seeing people and constantly in social situations, and it doesn't give you that time to process. Also a lot of questionable haircuts, which is I shaved my head.
Yeah, I mean, my hair's like all sorts of colors at the moment.
Yeah. So one of our last questions, how, because obviously you've talked about like we as a queer community, and specifically like when we're in these physical spaces, whether that's club nights, you know, or cafes and so on, we still have a long way to go when it comes to racism and trans inclusion and just kind of fostering genuinely inclusive community spaces. And with kind of having this period of pause and quarantine, how do you think coming out of this we can do better, you know, to kind of really encourage these spaces and be accountable?
I think the main thing is just remembering everything that we've learned during this period. I think there's definitely going to be a tendency for people to sort of rush to like get things back to as they were before, but while we also do want to regain some of that normalcy, I think that we also need to remember that like things weren't perfect before, and that we should learn from this and try to improve things rather than just return them to how they were before. I think you know, like really making an effort to make sure that Black and brown people and trans people are getting like equal opportunities for jobs and like equal salaries, and sort of like, you know, if you're creative, like questioning whoever's hiring you on these things, and actually making sure that you're using your privilege to like open up those opportunities for more marginalized people. You know, I think that we can all make an effort to make events and spaces more accessible for people with different needs. You know, writing accessibility reports and providing things like headphones and being aware of lights and etc. and noise, and like ramps, etc. I think just like centering and amplifying the voices of everyone who's more marginalized, like carrying that into real life from virtual spaces, I think will be really important to see.
Yeah, actually learning from our digital spaces and how the benefits that they've had in figuring out how to put that in real spaces, for sure. on to one of our last questions. What do you hope for kind of the queer community, or like what kind of words of love and inspiration do you have for your community going forward? I know that's kind of cheesy, but like what are your hopes and dreams for this year, both personally and just kind of as a community?
I just wish that, you know, everyone was more aware of the fact that we are all closer together than we think, and that is way more important than any sort of like petty differences or bigotry that might have remained. And I think as queer people, we've already come some of the way in terms of, you know, reflecting on our learnings from society, because we've had the chance to remove ourselves from that in accepting our sexuality and gender. But I think we just need to like go even further and make sure that we're properly distancing ourselves from all the horrible like things that we've learned, and actually reflecting on how we can change our perceptions of each other and the world towards a more positive way. I hope that this time will have helped people in the community feel far more comfortable in just owning and being exactly who they are, whatever feels free, and knowing that every single individual thing that we do that helps us feel closer to being free and being who we are is a rebellion in itself. We just need to like come together and be happy and joyous in that, and use that happiness and joy to like push back against anything that stops us being that way.
Yeah, completely. It's that idea of queer joy is an act of rebellion. And I also really agree with what you were saying about this idea of infighting. And I definitely think that, you know, connects to this idea of like cancel culture and so on, and why, while it's so important to have accountability, I agree that we need to shift it more to it being a conversation and to being something constructive, you know, inviting people in rather than shutting those people out. Like sometimes you have to shut them out, but a lot of the time it can be a dialogue.
Yeah, I think with that kind of movement of, as we were talking earlier, of like activism moving into an online space, one of the problems with that is that on Twitter or on Instagram, there's only so much nuance you can have in messages. Like, you know, there's like infographics and graphic things with like a few words on it, and through the sort of like white girl bossy feminism vibes that we see a lot on social media, they've just sort of bought into this idea that somehow people are toxic, and that at every sort of tiny instance where they don't align with whatever makes you feel amazing, you should just cut them out of your lives. And there's so much between that. Like obviously there are some red lines, and you know, but there's so much space in between that where it's important to work with members of your community to build together and grow together and support one another. Like obviously it has to be mutual, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's going to be one way. You just sort of hope that it's going to come back round, as long as that's not going to overstep your boundaries. I think, yeah, it's like, I think it's really important for us to grow together.
You know, I definitely think when you take away that kind of fear and kind of protectiveness of cancel culture, and if you say the wrong thing, you're out, people are more willing to show their vulnerability and show the areas that they can learn, and then it just makes that kind of conversation easier. And lastly, so if people wanted to get involved in kind of some of the communities that you work with and your work, where can they find you? Where should they look?
So I'm on Instagram at Prishita _Elouise, also on Twitter at Prishita_MA. But you know, I would highly recommend following along with the Voices for London's work. We're also on Instagram at Voices like for LDN. It's all one word. And like, please like subscribe to our newsletter and like sign up to the mailing list, because you know, we are going to be trying a lot harder, especially as everything's digital, to be sending out regular actions and like updates on how the community is doing and what actions we're working on at the moment and how everyone can help out. So that would be so great. If you know, the wider that network is, the stronger our actions are. And most of the time it's a tiny thing like sending an email or signing a petition, which really doesn't take a lot of time, but every voice helps. And you can read my writing at Bricks or Galdem or like I've written something for Days. I mean, a few different magazines, but yeah, just online. And if anyone would like to pitch to Bricks for a politics piece, then my email is also on my Instagram.
And lastly, what is your deepest, darkest secret? That's all I was really here for.
My deepest, darkest secret. My deepest, darkest secret is that even though I've been a vegetarian since I was 3 and I've been a vegan for the last like 3 or 4 years, I ate a lamb kebab sandwich when I was like 12 or 13 in Jordan, just out of the blue.
You know what? Sometimes you have to live large. I mean, like you tried it and then you're good.
Yeah.
You should try everything once.
But it just brings me shame.
I can just see you lying in bed at night being like, God,
Yeah.
no one can know.
Can't believe I did that.
Now we know your secret's out in the world and none of us are going to judge you. Well, thank you so much, Prishita, for talking to me this rainy Wednesday evening. And yeah, thank you for being on Cookie Bites. And hopefully we'll get to meet and connect in the real world soon.
Thanks so much. Lovely to chat to you.
Sorry, I decided to dress up a little bit to mark the occasion.